Let's see. Today we're going to be talking about Jesse Stevens Taylor and Hurricane Hazel. So this is the last Armchair History program of the year, but we'll be more than likely starting them back up again in 2021. I'd like to thank the Southport Library and the Friends of the Library in helping us to spread the word about today's presentation. Again, please feel free to ask questions. Just unmute your mic and then mute yourself back. And as I said, we're recording and we are also, I believe, on Facebook. Okay, if you attended last month's presentation, then you'll remember that I spoke about Margaret Taylor Harper, the first woman in North Carolina to run for statewide public office. And you might have wondered to yourself, how did Margaret have so much self-confidence? Well, we might find out a little bit about that today because I'm going to introduce you to Margaret's mother, Jessie Stevens Taylor. And I think you'll find that Jessie Taylor had her own share of self-confidence as well. So here's the timeline for our discussion today. It basically spans from 1879 to 1961, which correlates to the lifespan of Jessie Stevens Taylor. Mostly, though, we're going to focus on very closely on a single day in her life and in Southport's history, and that day is October 15th, 1954, the day that Hurricane Hazel came to town. So as you see in this chart, in 1902, Jessie Stevens became Southport's volunteer weather observer. She was 23 years old at the time and living with her parents. At that same time, her father, E.B. Stevens, became Southport's storm warning display man. Now, 20 years later, Jessie's father passed away, and by that time she was married and she was the mother of 3 children with 1 more on the way. But regardless of all that, she took over her father's duties and became Southport's storm warning display woman, and that was a role that she would hold for the rest of her life. So the storm warning display person was an important job in Southport. As you all know, the town's livelihood was dependent on the water, whether it was for commercial fishing and shrimping, piloting vessels up and down the river to Wilmington, running charter boats for tourists. And in addition to all that, most people lived very near to the water. So this map shows all the Atlantic hurricane tracks from 1851 to 2019. Now, I know we're used to looking at these spaghetti kind of maps that show possible hurricane paths, but that's not what this is. These are actual hurricane tracks that occurred during that 158-year period. And as you can see, well, you can't see the Cape Fear because so many of these pass through, you can't even see it. So many storms pass through this region. So the reason for that, for all these storms, is because hurricanes form under very specific conditions. It forms in the tropical waters in areas of high humidity, light winds, and warm sea surface temperatures. And so the areas they usually form in is between the latitudes of 8 degrees and 20 degrees, which is what I marked with the red lines there. The perfect temperature for a hurricane is approximately 79 degrees, the water temperature. If the water's colder than that, the hurricane will most likely weaken, and if it's warmer, it will grow very rapidly. So here's an image of the warm areas of water in the Atlantic Ocean that's known as Hurricane Alley, where most hurricanes develop. These waters are usually at their warmest temperatures from July until mid-October, which is the height of hurricane season. But as we know, hurricanes have been known to develop as early as June and as late as November. So nowadays we have a lot of satellite technology and computer modeling that enable us to know about even the slightest weather disturbances when they're very far away, and that gives us plenty of time to prepare. We also have advanced communication systems via televisions and the internet and the 24/7 weather channel and Facebook and emergency apps on our phone. But in the first half of the 20th century, things were very different. The newly formed Weather Bureau struggled to know about storms in advance. By the 1950s, meteorologists felt they were doing a good job if they were able to give an advisory 1 day into the future. A lot of times it was just a few hours or even an hour. It was not until 1964 that they could forecast 3 days into the future. and as recently as 2001, that they could forecast 5 days into the future. But of course, knowing the forecast is only the first step. The second step is communicating that information to the public in a timely manner. And for the first 50 or 60 years of the Weather Bureau's existence, which was the same period that Jessie Taylor and her father were the storm warning display people, it was also a challenge to get weather information to the public. There were some people who had radios, and there were a few who had televisions, but overall, people were just not in as close communication as we are today. So believe it or not, a primary method of communication were the weather towers. This is an image of Southport's weather tower, which stood on the Garrison lawn. It was built in 1902, and it stood up until February of this year. It's hard to believe that was still just this year. The tower was authorized by US Congress to be part of the newly established Weather Bureau. It was shipped to Southport in care of Jessie Stevens' father, E.B. Stevens. It came all the way from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. The tower was made of steel and stood 50 feet high. And then it had a 25-foot pole that was attached to the tower, giving it a total height of 75 feet. Various signal flags were flown from the tower to signify weather conditions. These flags could be seen by mariners on the river and at sea, as well as by Southport residents on the land. So you can see the solid red flag meant a hurricane may be threatening within 72 hours. And then if there was a black dot in the middle, it meant it may be 36 hours. And if there were two of those flags, it meant within 24 hours. And then the green flag was the all clear. So as you can see, there were a lot of flags for Jessie to be toting back and forth out to that tower and hoisting up to give people signals. So, as I said, for the first 20 years of Jessie's service, she volunteered as a weather observer for the newly formed National Weather Service. But what does that mean exactly? Well, what she did was she made daily observations of temperatures, wind speed, and precipitation, and she reported them to the Bureau via telegraph. She probably didn't do the telegraphing. She probably took it to a telegraph office. Then after her father passed away in 1922, Jessie's duties expanded to include being the storm warning display woman. And then that's when she became responsible for providing information about storms to members of the community and ships at sea. So that's when she would start going out and manually hoisting those heavy flags on the flag tower on the Garrison lawn. Over the next 32 years, Jessie did her job well. The people of Southport depended on her to let them know when a storm was coming so they could respond. Of course, sometimes Jessie only had an hour or two's notice of an impending storm, so she couldn't give enough advance warning. And other times, just as happens today, the Weather Service got it wrong by predicting a bad storm that then fizzled out or changed paths and missed Southport altogether. And that uncertainty about the predictions caused some people to grow skeptical about the weather forecast, and sometimes it was a little bit hard for Jessie to get people to take her warning seriously, which I'm sure frustrated her because she worked so hard to keep her community safe. In 1954, the waterfront along Southport was a busy commercial area that's very different than what you see today. There were about 20 shrimp docks. At times, there could be 100 shrimp boats out in the water. More than 100 people worked at the shrimp houses that lined the docks. And there were also pogie boats coming in and out, and their crews could be heard singing sea shanties as they worked in the water catching menhaden. River pilots steered commercial ships up and down the Cape Fear. And numerous businesses lined the water skirt, like a grocery store, restaurants, shipyards, and of course, the Stewart Inn. This is a picture of the intersection of Howe and Bay Street shortly before Hazel. And you can see the River Pilot Tower, and then that tree that's there, I should use the cursor, the tree that's there, that marks where the Whittler's Bench, which everyone called the Cedar Bench. You can see that Bay Street is still not paved, it's just a sandy road. The white building in the front is Mac's Cafe, where Oliver's is today. And in the distance, you can see, just barely see the tower, the weather tower standing on the Garrison lawn. Here is the waterfront from the Whittler's Bench, and you can see shrimp houses and shrimp boats lined up. And here's another view from one of the docks. A lot of these pictures were taken by Art Newton, who was a professional photographer in Southport during those years. This is the shrimp house that belongs to Leila and Dallas Piggott. They owned one of the larger shrimp companies in Southport, and you'll be hearing a little bit more from Leila today, I'm hoping. It all looks very peaceful, but after Hazel, all of the shrimp houses and docks are gone, and then most of the boats will survive Hazel, but they won't be found in the river. But watching over Southport was Jessie Stevens Taylor, and here she is in 1954 sitting in front of her weather tower. By that point, she was a 75-year-old grandmother of 2. She had been volunteering with the Weather Bureau for over 50 years. She had shepherded Southport through many storms throughout the years, but she had never faced down anything like Hurricane Hazel, which was the only Category 4 hurricane to hit North Carolina in the 20th century. Despite her age and diminutive size, it would have been a mistake to underestimate Jessie Taylor in 1954. She still went out to hoist up these great big heavy flags when she needed to. Her husband had passed away 10 years earlier, but she was lucky enough to have 2 grandsons, Ed and Jimmy Harper, who she could enlist in helping her to hoist those flags. So on Thursday, October 14th, the United States Weather Bureau issued a warning for the Carolinas. Hurricane Hazel was headed near shore, but they predicted that the worst of the hurricane was expected to stay offshore. But instead, the storm took a sharp northwest turn and headed toward land. By evening of the same day, they had changed the forecast, and now it was forecasted to make landfall somewhere near the Carolinas border. Further forecast expected Hazel to lose its power and just sort of dissipate over the Allegheny Mountains. But like many storms, Hazel was following her own path. So Thursday night, Jessie stayed up all night long, keeping in communication with the Weather Bureau and other southern ports by telephone. It was an anguishing night. Without planes or satellites to monitor the storm, there were times that the Weather Service actually wasn't certain of its location. It's likely that one man Jessie relied on for information, either directly or indirectly, was Grady Norton, the Weather Bureau's chief storm forecaster for the southeastern area of the United States. 60-year-old Norton had also been putting in long days. He'd been putting in 12-hour days trying to monitor the path of this deadly storm. On October 9th, a week before the storm hit North Carolina, he suffered a stroke and died the same day. I'm sure his leadership and expertise was missed during the next week as Hazel, one of the most erratic storms in hurricane history, headed toward the Caribbean and then on to the mainland. Early in the morning of October 15th, the National Weather Bureau reports were still contradictory. Mac McGlamory, the owner of Mac's Cafe along the waterfront, grew so concerned that at 2 in the morning, he called the Coast Guard to ask them where the storm was, and they couldn't tell him. By daylight, water was already splashing across the bulkhead behind his restaurant. Likewise, Jessie Taylor was growing concerned about the approaching storm. She had been observing and recording Southport's weather for over 50 years. She saw the barometer dropping rapidly, and she knew what that meant. She picked up the phone and began calling people who lived and worked along the water. She told them they better hurry and get their boats secured and their families moved to higher ground. And at almost precisely 10 o'clock in the morning, the storm came through. So here's a picture of the storm waters rising. The storm actually hit during the high tide of a full moon, the worst time that it could hit. So Leila Piggott, a Southport resident, she would later recall that she and a friend had stopped at Quack's Sea Shack that morning for a quick breakfast. And I believe Quack's Sea Shack was located where Flava's Ice Cream is now. And they stopped there while their husbands were tending to the boats and the business. And they had a very quick breakfast, only there a few minutes. And when they came back out, the water was already up to their knees and they knew that they were in trouble. Leila said, looking back on that morning, it was the last decent meal that she was to have for 3 weeks. So in this picture, I want to point out the people standing on the porch there watching the water rise. So in the next, because you can see in the next picture, This is the same street, the same corner, and there's the house, and then in the front yard is a boat. So they've been where they've been standing there watching. There's now a boat in their yard. And then here's a close-up of the boat. And as you can see, it didn't just come by itself. It had been attached to a dock, and it brought the dock with it. So there's some pieces of broken dock there, and it looks like a gas pump that also had come with it. So the whole thing looks rather dangerous. And these are pictures of Quack Sea Shack, where Leela had stopped to have breakfast that morning. So not look like it was open for business. Mm-hmm. Did somebody have a question? Okay. This is another picture of the water. You can see how deep it got. And just some of the more destruction, the cars and the boats and the buildings, everything just demolished in just a couple of hours. Here is the weather tower on the Garrison lawn after Hazel had passed through. So you can see the remnants of the flags that Jesse had put up. They're torn to shreds now from the wind. And you can also see the tower, it was bent, but it was still standing. So at landfall, the hurricane brought a storm surge of over 18 feet to just a large area of coastline, producing severe coastal damage. Brunswick County suffered the heaviest damage, where most of the coastal dwellings were either destroyed or severely damaged. The National Oceanic and Atmospheric Association said every pier in a distance of 170 miles of coastline was demolished. So in this picture, you can see the Riverside Motel there, just to give you a perspective on where this is. This, I think, is still Bay Street. And here you can see the River Pilots Tower, Harrelson's Groceries on the right, and Mac's Restaurant. And this is Whittler's Bench. After Hazel, you can see it's just been totally demolished. This is the Yacht Basin. And here's another boat that's not going the right way. So just destruction everywhere. So the previous pictures that I showed you were largely from Art Newton. As I mentioned, he was a professional photographer in Southport at the time, and he actually even put together a booklet about Hurricane Hazel after it happened with all of his pictures. The following pictures that I'm going to show you were recently donated to the museum by Ann Holt via LED Young. So Ms. Holt found them among her family possessions. She knew that they were taken by a distant relative named Herbert Winston, who came for a visit, but she said she didn't know anything more about the contents. So this is an example of how local historical societies can help preserve local history through the help of the community, and can kind of act as a conduit, a place for people to come together. So I posted this picture on Facebook, and I asked if anyone knew who these people were. And I said, my assumption is these people own this boat. And so does anybody know who owns this boat? Because they had their picture taken sort of like, oh, what a bad day we're having. Here's our boat. It's up on dry land. So it just shows you shouldn't make assumptions, especially about history. So I did get responses back from people right away, and they said, no, those people don't own the boat. They're standing there because that's their yard. That is Captain Harold and Alice Winston St. George. And they're standing there saying, look what a day we're having. There's a boat in our yard. So their house was on the corner of Moore and Caswell, and the boat had been dumped in their yard by the storm. So more recently, I was listening to an oral history interview with Leela Piggott conducted by David Soselski. Now, I had listened to this interview, I think last year when I first started researching Hurricane Hazel. But when I listened to it at the time, when I listened to it again, I realized that she was actually telling a story about this the boat in this picture. So I'm going to play a portion of the interview for you, but I'm not sure. I'm going to start it and then stop it so somebody can tell me whether you can hear it, because I think I forgot to click something when I did this. So let me try.
Yacht. I didn't tell you about the yacht. That was.
Okay, could you guys hear that?
Yes.
You could? Okay, well then we'll go back and I will do it again. That's good. Oh, go back to there.
Yacht. I didn't tell you about the yacht that was tied up over here on the west, and I was looking at her. Her name was the Stardust Spy. She was owned by John Pelusi in Wilmington, and I watched her break away loose. She knocked the garage completely down and the steps and part of the porch of the house next door, and was headed straight for my 3 windows in there. And I went into shock. I couldn't move. And Dallas happened to come in and look at me and saw what was happening and grabbed me. In fact, he pulled so hard I fell on the floor, and he dragged me into the dining room. He was so sure, and we both were, that they were coming in, that boat was coming in those 3 windows. There's a space about that far between those windows and my front bedroom. We watched, by peeking around, we watched when it hit it, and the sheetrock bowed in.
What did it hit?
It hit our house.
On the bedroom there?
Between the bedroom and the windows.
Wow.
And broke the sheetrock on the inside of the wall.
Between the
living room and
living room windows and the bedroom?
Front bedroom.
Wow.
In a space just about that far. And then it hit the corner and tore that loose. It hit those palm trees, it was only one then. Hit that, and it knocked it out in the middle of the street, and it ended up almost to where that station wagon is. That's how much water we had.
How deep did it get outside?
It was an 18-foot mean low water. 18 feet.
So what's that mean for the street out here?
Well, it was covered.
No,
and the water was up to my floors, and the water was coming in my heat ducts. And this whole floor was wet, underwater. And there was 14 inches in that house over there.
I don't like the idea of boats floating around me like that.
I don't guess so.
No, that made me nervous.
Okay, so hopefully you guys could all hear that. And so I thought that was fascinating that she was telling this story about this boat. She had seen it coming. It almost went into her house. It did bang into her house, almost came through the window while she was standing there watching it, just mesmerized, in shock. The person she was talking to was David Soselsky, who's a noted historian of the Cape Fear area. And the person, she mentioned Dallas grabbed her. That was her husband. Did somebody have a question?
Yeah, Liz, do you know whether that boat was in the Southport harbor or whether it was up in Wilmington and came down?
No, I think it was here, that somebody had it here. Does anybody else know? I'm pretty sure. Part of the reason I'm sure is that she told another story in that, in that interview where she was talking about somebody who managed to get their boat out into the river. And when she asked him later, you know, did you have much trouble going upriver? Because he went all the way to Wilmington. And he said, I didn't have to, I wouldn't even have had to run my motor. He said it was pushing us so fast. All I was doing was trying to avoid trees and houses and debris and everything. It just, the wind was just shoving us. So I would think it was probably going the other way, with my extensive marine knowledge. So if anyone else knows, please let me know.
Thanks.
So that was a good question. And if anybody else has any, let me know. And the one thing I was curious about was she was telling the story about being there by the window and her husband coming and practically, you know, dragging her away and doing all that. I was just curious how old she was when this was going on. So she would have been about 38 and her husband was about 43 as they were digging themselves through this, this whole challenge. So, okay, so these are more snapshots from the ones that were donated. Just gives us some different perspectives from the ones that we're used to seeing. And again, this is the tower from the other direction. More damage. There's a roof of a house without a house underneath it. And some more debris. Just boats everywhere. Okay, so so this is Leela in 1999. I think at the time that she gave that interview with David Soselsky, it was 35 years after Hazel. So I'm going to play one more clip from her interview that kind of, you know, sums up a little bit about that day.
3 o'clock, it was perfectly calm, and we decided to get out and walk. So the neighbors next door came over here, and I went over to their houses to see how much damage. Then we got together and we started walking and stopping at each house. And believe it or not, we cried every time we saw each other. It was many tears were shed that day. However, not one single soul in Southport was injured or killed or died. But I'll tell you this, we sure cried, especially when we got down, tried to get down on the waterfront. It was unreal. There was not a single building left on the entire waterfront. 17 shrimp houses gone, plus all the other little houses and everything. There was nothing left but piling. And so you can imagine how we felt.
Okay, so if you're interested in learning more, hearing more about that, her whole interview is out on the internet, and it's really interesting. It's quite long, but of course you can just listen to parts of it at a time. It's very well done. So,
Liz,
yes.
in the recording from Leela there was a little garbled, but to understand that she was talking about all the houses on the actual waterfront side
Yes.
of Bay Street, because none of the houses that sit up on Bay Street were damaged. She was talking about the shrimp houses and the stores and that sort of thing.
Yeah, which was her livelihood. So
yes,
I think that was
absolutely.
Quite distressing for her and for the people, her friends, who also probably were in the shrimping business. But yes, it was just all along Bay Street. All the houses were wiped out. So when Hazel hit in 1954, Leela and her husband owned a large shrimp company in Southport, one of the largest ones in Southport. And despite the devastation to the waterfront and the many tears that people shed over the destruction, the Picketts did quickly rebuild their shrimp business. So according to Leela, Southport was considered the shrimp capital of the world at that time, and shrimping was definitely the cornerstone of Southport's economy. It employed a lot of people. Within hours of the hurricane, huge cranes arrived from the Sunny Point Association loading depot. I think they were from Diamond Construction Company that were working on Sunny Point at the time. And they came and lifted the shrimp trawlers back into the water and brushed away the debris. So when the storm hit, the Picketts had actually been in the process of building a new building, and they had just put the floor in. I believe it was where Fishy Fishy is now. They managed to gather up the floorboards that had been scattered in the storm, and they worked on reconstructing that platform. And then they dubbed it the Open Air Shrimp House, and they did manage to start processing shrimp on that platform. When it got dark, they ran the town's Christmas lights, the red and green Christmas lights that were used at Christmas. They ran them from a generator on Nash Street down all the way to the waterfront to provide some kinds of light to work by. 50 hours after Hazel hit, the 28 trawlers in the Pickett fleet were fishing, and around 60 residents of Southport were back to work processing the catches. Now, I only know the Pickett story because they told their story. I don't know if the other shrimping businesses were also back in business, or if it was just the Picketts first and the other ones followed. Within a few days of the storm, though, trucks were once again running up to Fulton Fish Market in New York City, fully loaded with shrimp. Within 3 weeks, their brand new building was completed and they were averaging 7,500 pounds of shrimp daily, which seems like a lot to me. So, of course, the devastation wasn't limited to Southport. Oak Island, which was then called Long Beach, was hit very hard. Before the storm, there were 357 buildings out there. After the storm, only 5 of those buildings were left standing. The official report from the Weather Bureau stated that as a result of Hazel, all traces of civilization on the immediate waterfront between the state line and the Cape Fear were practically annihilated. Roseanne, I think you need to mute yourself. Okay, so there's an interesting story about a couple who ended up riding out the storm on Long Beach. They were on their honeymoon, and apparently they had other things on their mind than the weather. In 1954, Jerry Helms was a 21-year-old serviceman stationed at Fort Bragg, and his bride was 17-year-old Connie Hauser. And they were spending a few days in a family home on the island someone had lent to them for their honeymoon. And when the storm hit, they were sure they were going to die, especially Connie, who didn't know how to swim. So they went to the top floor of the house that they were in, but the water just kept rising and rising. So finally, they pushed a mattress out of a second floor window right out onto the water. So the water was high enough that they could just push a mattress right out on top of it like a raft. They clung to the mattress for dear life. It eventually got tangled in the top of a tree. And so then they clung to the tree until the waters receded. And Connie said that all sorts of debris was being hurled at them while they were there, but somehow they managed to hold on. And when the waters receded, they were still holding on to the tree, and they managed to climb down the tree, and miraculously they survived the storm, and they spent the rest of their lives telling the tale of how they did it. A few months after Hurricane Hazel, Jessie Stevens Taylor was honored by the Weather Bureau with a luncheon in Washington, D.C. She was presented with a medal for her years of service and for her heroic efforts during Hurricane Hazel. She responded to all of the attention with good-natured, self-deprecating humor, saying, "I think some of them left their homes that night just so they could come back and make sport of me. To be truthful, I wasn't as sure as I should have been myself." So then in April of 1955, so about 6 months after Hurricane Hazel, Mrs. Taylor received a letter of commendation from President Eisenhower. And he wrote, "Dear Mrs. Taylor, I have learned from Secretary Weeks of your long and devoted service as a cooperative observer for the Weather Bureau. In providing regular reports during the past 55 years on the weather conditions in your locality, you have made an important contribution to the work of the Bureau and to the welfare of your fellow Americans. Along with congratulations on your outstanding record, I send my thanks for your very unselfish service. With best wishes, Dwight Eisenhower." Mrs. Taylor was presented with a silver medal for her more than 50 years of meritorious service, including warning about the approaching Hurricane Hazel, by the Undersecretary of Commerce in Washington, D.C. And her commendation read, "Mrs. Taylor's prompt action in displaying service flags and lights on the weather tower before Hazel gave warning of the approaching hurricane to both coastwise shipping and people living in the area, and undoubtedly saved hundreds of lives." So this medal, along with one of Jessie's flags, is on display at the Southport Maritime Museum. Southport also remembered Mrs. Taylor's service, and a few years after her passing, a monument was erected on the Garrison lawn at the base of the weather tower. And it reads, "Mrs. Jessie Stevens Taylor, 1879 to 1961. She loved her God, country, and fellow man. She served here as a voluntary weather observer and storm warning display woman from 1900 to 1961, erected in 1966 by U.S. Army friends." And then this is the installation of a marker on Oak Island. It's across the road from Old Bridge Diner. It's on the right side of the road as you're leaving the island. The man on the left is Jerry Helms. He was the man who was honeymooning on Oak Island during the storm. And the man on the right is Jay Barnes, who grew up in Southport and has written several books on hurricanes, including North Carolina's hurricane history, which is a great resource if you want to learn more. He also keeps updating it every few years as we get more hurricanes. 6 days after Hazel, Southport's newspaper, the Southport Pilot, wrote about the post-hurricane mess. They said there can be no quarrel with the way our people have pitched in to pick up the broken pieces, nor can there be much question in the minds of those who know them that Brunswick County progress will be moving again at an accelerated pace. And for their 50-year retrospective, Jim Harper, who was the former editor and publisher of the Southport Pilot, remembered Hazel and said it was the most transforming event of the 20th century for this community. And as you can see in the articles, there's a reference, honeymoon couple survives Hazel. That's a reference to that story. And then of course, this up above, 9 persons killed. That's a reference to some of what Jane was talking about before we started, and I'm sure she can tell us more about that. While Hazel caused the most damage in the Carolinas, the storm did not lose all of its intensity as they had predicted. So you can see how quickly it was moving. On the right-hand side, you can see at 7 o'clock on Thursday evening, it was out here, and then by 7 a.m., that's when it was just offshore. And that's when Jesse Taylor started calling people saying, you know, you better get your boat secured. And then 12 hours later, it was all the way up in Pennsylvania. And as you can see, it continued all the way up to Toronto. So here's the track of it that shows how it was really pretty erratic. And especially at that time when they had no satellites or anything really to track it as well as we can now. So going north, it should have weakened, right? They usually weaken. But instead, what happened is it merged with a cold front. So when it did that, there was another storm that it merged with. It retained its hurricane strength winds. It continued to drop heavy rainfall. So it went through Virginia, West Virginia, Maryland, Delaware, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, New York. It was knocking out trees. It was knocking out power. There were wind gusts that were up to 100 miles an hour. Even by the time it got to Pennsylvania, it was tearing the roofs off of houses. And then it went on up to Toronto, where it caused major devastation and flooding. And in fact, 81 people died and over 4,000 families were left homeless. And it's still one of the worst natural disasters in Canada's history. They were just totally unprepared for anything like what had happened. So here are the final stats for Hazel. It caused extensive damage all the way from Haiti, where between 400 and 1,000 people were killed, all the way up to Canada. In the US, Brunswick County got the full brunt of the storm, but miraculously, only 12 people lost their lives in the county. And many of the rest who were saved was due in part to the timely and accurate storm warnings provided by Jesse Taylor. So as you probably know, Jesse's weather tower was destroyed in February of this year. After standing for 118 years and having survived so many severe hurricanes, it was brought down by an unnamed windstorm in the middle of winter. So there is a project underway by the city to restore the tower as historically accurately as possible. It's estimated it's going to be completed early next year. Everyone's welcome to contribute to the Weather Tower Preservation Fund, and there will be a plaque listing names of people who donate at certain levels. So if you wish to contribute, you can find more details on the city website because it's a city project. So I hope you've enjoyed learning a little bit about Jesse Stevens Taylor and the Hurricane Hazel and Southport's weather tower. I'm going to turn this back around and answer any questions, and hopefully Jane can tell us a little bit more about the family that she was talking about that didn't survive. So here we go. All right. Does anybody have questions, comments?
Very well done, Liz. And I was happy to see more pictures that I haven't normally seen.
Yeah, those were just donated months ago.
Yeah, that was good. Yeah.
Liz,
Yes.
maybe a side story. The Lockwood Folly River backwash during Hurricane Hazel opened up a little bit of a canal about a mile up from the western end of Oak Island.
Oh, yeah?
That canal went straight through to the ocean. It took 2 to 2.5 years before the Army Corps of Engineers actually plugged up that hole and made Oak Island a whole island again.
Interesting. Interesting. We'll have to investigate that.
I wanted to add something about Tukey Potter.
Yes.
Maybe somebody on here knows him. I don't personally know him, but at about the second or third wooden boat show, he was demonstrating net mending, and I took a photograph of him and intended to paint it. And believe it or not, I didn't get around to finishing it till being at home during the COVID virus. So I have finished that, but I don't really know him personally. But in this article in the 2012 Our State magazine, he was a little boy, and he had been out that morning in his skiff fishing. And so he, wasn't worrying about the storm, anything. I mean, I think it was getting bad, but, so he starts home, and of course his mother has a fit when he gets there, but he's got a string of fish, and he'd been out in his skiff. And so his daddy said, you better take the oars out of that, take the oars out and sink it. And he didn't want to sink it, but he said, sink it. And sure enough, his was the only boat that did not get moved during, it was fine after the storm left. But so far as the people who died, I didn't know some of this till I read this article. I don't know if y'all are familiar at all with Odell Williamson, but he was a politician. He's the one that developed Ocean Isle. And his sister was married to a man named, his last name was Register. And he was managed a hardware store. And then there was another family that had the car dealership. And the two men that afternoon discussed whether or not to go on, they knew something was coming. And so one of them decided to stay across the river. There was no bridge. You had to go by a 2-vehicle cable ferry. That's how you got to Ocean Isle. And so anyway, Register went on because his family was over there. And his daughter Sonia was just 15, but she was already married. And Bunky Bellamy was in the military, and he was there vacationing before he got deployed somewhere. So they were there. And then the Registers had they had a, Buddy was, I think, 10. And then the Sonia, So when it began to hit, the 3 couples I knew, the Harts, the Armfields, and the Coxes, they all got in the truck. Register got all of them in the truck. Well, except that 2 of them, Sonia and Buddy, went another way. They went to a higher place. But I do know that Mrs. Hart said that she remembered Frank Armfield. The last time she saw him, she was floating away, and she looked back and she saw the truck door hit him. She thought maybe that he might have even gotten killed before he got drowned. I'm not sure about that. But anyway, so it ended up then that Register, his body eventually floated up. They never found Madeline's, the sister of Odell Williams. They never found her body, never came back up. Buddy's, the son, who was about 10, his body washed up. And the 2 that the Bellamy guy, who was married to Sonia, somehow or other, they miraculously got washed up too. at some point. And as I was saying before, you know, that Debbie Butler, and some of you might know what her position is. She's elected to something in New Hanover County. And anyway, she was the granddaughter of the Armfield couple. And I do know the Maritime Museum. I do know that at the old Maritime Museum, I remember they had a newspaper account of that. I remember reading some of that, and I imagine the new Maritime Museum, you know, has some of that information too.
Yeah, maybe they do. I haven't read that article in a while. Wasn't there something about the women and children were inside the truck, and then the men like stood outside and kind of
Yes, there were four men. Yeah. But like I said, there was something about Mrs. Hart said that the door swinging and hitting Frank Armfield. Maybe he was standing outside and the door. Yes, yeah, but it was the women were inside and the men were outside. Yeah.
It's a sad thing. Yeah, very sad story. So, right. Thank you for sharing that. Does anybody else have any questions?
Well, there's just one other thing I'll say is that there I was in Greensboro, but it's now UNCG, but it was Women's College, and we had a drought. And of course, my freshman year, I had a new raincoat, a new umbrella that had never been used. And we were under drought conditions, and we had to start taking a bath. If we had a bath, we could take it once a week with 1 inch of water, and we had to take a buddy to the bathroom because we were having to conserve water. And so then Hazel changed all that, and there was not good communication. So I had my new raincoat and my umbrella, went to class because they didn't have good communication. And finally, when they got word to the students to go back and shelter in the dorms, we're out there and limbs are falling off trees, and my umbrella, flipped inside out. Anyway, it was a mess. So even in Greensboro.
Sorry, I'm trying to mute myself because my phone's going off. Yeah, I know Tommy Harrelson has told me some stories that from when he lived through it. I mean, his father's grocery store was totally wiped out. They had been on the island and they had just moved back into town, like maybe a few weeks before it happened. I guess when school started, but everything was wiped out up there. Whole houses were moved, belongings were moved, and I guess there were looters. And Lila talked some about the National Guard coming and, just kind of being there. Or she just said with flashlights, just walking around, just people knowing you couldn't be living and things like that. So very, very difficult time. The one other thing I'll tell you, she talked about how she didn't get a decent meal for 3 weeks, but she did have a gas cooker and she cooked on that. And people were saying that's what they used mostly was the gas or so. And I read another article, and I think it was by Susie Carson, and she was saying that one thing she remembered was her mom had a gas cooker thing that cooked on gas, and so she could cook things. And so people, your refrigerators were going and stuff. So people would bring her chickens, and she just kept cooking, and she kept making chicken bog. And Jane, are you familiar with chicken bog?
Me?
Yeah, a chicken bog. Okay, well, I'd never heard of it, so I got real curious about it. And I looked it up, and it's delicious. It's like it's like rice and chicken broth and some chicken and then what other vegetables you have on hand, and you just kind of cook it, and it's like warm and good. And she just kept making quantities of chicken bog and giving it back to people and cooking, which was a really nice thing for her to do. And now, my husband and I have this new favorite recipe, and so whenever the weather gets cold, we're like, it's chicken bog season. Oh, also sausage. You put sausage in it too. That's what really makes it good. So it's chicken, rice, veggies, and a little bit of sausage, and it's really good. So, all right. Well, thank you all so much for coming. And we still have some programs coming up over the next few weeks. Pat is going to be on December 1st. Pat will be doing a Living Voices presentation of Kate Stewart. So that'll be good. The day after tomorrow, we have our general meeting, which is in the evening, so that's at 6:30, and Norma Eckert will be coming. She is with, Norma's actually on, I think. She is with the Friends of the Fort Caswell Rifle Range, and so she's going to be talking about that and about a book that they've just written and published about the Great War in Brunswick County and the Great War. So that will be really good. That's Thursday at 6:30. And then Pat's thing is next, and then Pat's lovely presentation of Living Voices. And then I'm just trying to remember them all. Our second Tuesday talk in December will be Desi Bridge, who is a food historian, and she will be talking about fixing Christmas dinner during World War II when all the rationing was going on. And we thought it would be really relevant as people are, you know, there's not always the stuff at the grocery store that we want these days, and trying to make substitutions. So she's going to be talking about that. And on December 12th, we're going to be doing the Winterfest. We'll be doing a video like we did for the 4th of July, and we're going to have, we have an interview with the fire chief talking about doing Christmas, you know, with Santa and the fire department. Pat is also going to be talking about Susie Carson and Christmas in old-fashioned Christmas. And we'll also be talking about the Holiday House, which was the Women's Club used to put on, and Ginger Harper will be talking about that. So, and then we'll have a little bit of singing, and it's going to be wonderful. So be sure and look for that as well. So that's everything, and I hope to see you guys around.